get rid of that. All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Berman Institute biweekly seminar. And welcome to those who are joining online as well. If you are online, it's the usual sort of protocol. Feel free to drop any questions in the question Q&A box, and we'll take them in order of appearance during the discussion part of today's seminar. But I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today on behalf of the Institute, and really pleased to have Dr. Carolyn Sufrin here with us, who's a medical anthropologist and obstetrician gynecologist here at Johns Hopkins. Always a pleasure to have colleagues close by come and join us for these seminars. She's an associate professor in the Department of OB in the School of Medicine, as well as associate director for the Center for Medical Humanities and Social Medicine in the School of Medicine. She's also, as you can see on the slide, faculty in the Department of Health, Behavior, and Society here in the Bloomberg School of Public Health. She's done extensive work on reproductive health issues affecting those who are incarcerated, and that includes providing clinical care in jails, conducting research, doing policy engagement, and other advocacy activities. Dr. Sufrin is the founder and director of the Hopkins-based research group Advocacy and Research on Reproductive Wellness in Incarcerated People. Yeah, as you can tell, her work is sort of situated at the intersection of reproductive justice, healthcare, and mass incarceration. And she has a new book, maybe not so new, not so new, but has a book out on this topic, which if you're interested, have a look. It's called Jail Care, Finding the Safety Net for Women Behind Bars. So join me in thanking Dr. Sufrin for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My one of my mentors from graduate school, she used to say that your book is new for 5 years. Just past that cutoff. Well, I am thrilled to be here today in person with all of you and virtually for those of you who are on Zoom. And I'm looking forward to the discussion as well. This is a niche topic, some people might think, but I hope what I convince you of is that this is something that we all should care about, that we can learn so much, not only about pregnant individuals behind bars, but also how our broader society, how they shed light on how our broader society values and devalues certain people's reproductive freedom. I didn't have the disclosure side, but I have no disclosures. And I want to start out by telling you a little bit of a story of a woman whom I call Deja, who is a research subject in one of the studies that I'm going to delve into more deeply. But I think it's a good opening to get us thinking about these issues. Deja told me and my research team, she said, she was pregnant and in jail. She said, "We're not looked at as people. We're looked at as inmates. So all of our decisions are taken from us, even with our pregnancies." Now, Deja was 10 weeks pregnant when she was arrested and booked into a county jail. With the prospect of an undetermined length of jail time looming, she decided she wanted an abortion, that she needed an abortion. But when she asked the jail doctor, he told her, "Oh, we don't do that here. We used to, but we don't do that anymore." Jail doctors also judged her. As Deja told me, none of the medical professionals here believe in abortion. So when I brought it up, I was instantly shot down. 2 different doctors. They both were like, "I've had this many kids and I would never get an abortion. Children are blessings. You shouldn't get an abortion," telling me all the different ways I was wrong and why I shouldn't get an abortion. This was in 2018, in a state with some of the most liberal abortion laws and access in the country. So for Deja and other pregnant people needing abortions while incarcerated, June 24th, 2022, the day the Dobbs decision was announced, was not a moment of rupture in their abilities to access abortion. So how do we make sense of her experience? What does it tell us more broadly about, like I said, differential valuing of people's reproductive capacities and what we anthropologists call stratified reproduction? What can we learn about incarcerated pregnant people in particular, and all pregnant people in general, to investigate abortion behind bars, out of the view of public scrutiny and in an explicitly controlling punitive environment? So just an overview and a roadmap of the sequence of things that I'm going to cover before we get to our discussion. I'm going to situate this problem of abortion and incarceration within the broader context of mass incarceration, how it affects women and people with the capacity to be pregnant, the experiences of their pregnancy, and what kind of healthcare they do and do not receive behind bars. I'll review the background on the legal status and research on access to abortion in custody pre-Dobbs. And then I'm going to spend a substantial part of the time sharing with you results of a study where we interviewed pregnant incarcerated people about their experiences trying to access abortion. A few thoughts about the post-Dobbs environment and some concluding reflections. Before I do so, just a brief note on terminology and some of the terms that I'll be using, unless when people themselves use the word inmate, like Deja described herself. I'll use person-centered language of incarcerated person or individual or people. Likewise, I will try to use gender-inclusive language when possible, recognizing that people with all gender identities who have a uterus have the capacity to be pregnant. But when I'm citing research that reports women, I will be using women. I will call the criminal legal system the legal system instead of the criminal justice system, because there's not much that's just about our current system. And although the phrasing correctional facility is a useful, sometimes umbrella term to describe prisons, jails, and other institutions of incarceration, I prefer to use carceral institution. Correctional implies that the individual needs to be corrected, not the system. So many of you might already be familiar with some of this, but so we're on the same page as to the historical and racial context of mass incarceration in the US that shapes people's abortion and pregnancy experiences behind bars. Over the last 50 or so years, we've seen an exponential rise in the number of people behind bars in the US in a way that is not necessarily proportional to increasing rates of serious crimes, and has much more to do with policies, policing, arrest policies, and sentencing that are marked by institutionalized racism and a retrenchment of the social safety net that has come to see incarceration as a solution, a very bad one, for social problems rather than investing in the safety net. This has played out very distinctly for women, and especially for women of color. And there are deep links between what's often called the child welfare system, or what others call the family regulation system. Between that system, the foster care system, the way that drug use in pregnancy has been criminalized rather than treated as a medical condition, and how Black women in particular, their parenting and pregnancy has been under much more criminal scrutiny, which if you're interested in this, I would highly recommend Michelle Goodwin's book, Policing the Womb. So what do we know about women behind bars? Well, data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics collected annually tells us that over the last 4 decades, we've seen an 800% increase in the number of females behind bars. Now, we did see a drop between 2019 and 2020. COVID, we saw a drop in all incarcerated populations, but we're now seeing that number increase, and it's increasing more rapidly for females, especially in jails, than it is for males. So the numbers are ticking back up. We know that the majority of women who are incarcerated are of reproductive age. They're younger than 45. And most of them are mothers and the primary caregivers to young children. So think about the collateral consequences of incarcerating a child's primary caregiver. We know that there are racial disparities, which are the downstream consequences of upstream structural racism and white supremacy, and that this affects Black women and as it's reported, American Indian and Alaskan Native women who are incarcerated at substantially higher rates than white women. So this is a lot of people that we're talking about, and a lot of families, and sort of the ripple effect. So then you might think, if the women who are incarcerated in our country are mothers and are young women, what do we know about how many pregnant people there are behind bars? And this could be another talk, maybe not a whole 1-hour talk, although I probably could expand that, fill the time to talk about this, because I think the construction of data and the illusions of data of what we do and don't know tell us so much about who we value and who we don't. But until recently, we had no idea how many pregnant people there were behind bars. We didn't know how many births happened. We knew knew that they happened. And federal agencies did collect the number of deaths behind bars, but not the number of births. Because why on earth would you ever think that a baby would be born in custody? It's just a disconnect there, and yet it happens. And so my research team here at Johns Hopkins did conduct a study where for 1 year we collected pregnancy outcomes data from a sample of 22 state prison systems, all federal prisons, and the 5 largest jails in the country. And though I'm not going to share all of the data because we collected many different outcomes, I'll just highlight the main pregnancy outcomes. And I think people often ask me, what's the takeaway from this study, which we call the Pregnancy in Prison Statistics or PIP study? The takeaway is just there are pregnant people behind bars, right? We need to acknowledge that. And so we found in our sample of prisons, there were nearly 1,400 admissions of pregnant people just to the sample of prisons in 1 year. And just at the 5 largest jails, we actually had 6 jails, but one was a small jail in rural Massachusetts. So just at these 6 jails, there were over 1,600 admissions of pregnant people. Imagine what that number would be if we extrapolated, which we did. It's not a perfect extrapolation, but we estimated that there would be 58,000 admissions of pregnant people each year. So again, this is not a small number of people or families that we're talking about. And their pregnancy, some of them had pregnancies that ended while they were in custody. Some of them left prison or jail while they were still pregnant. And especially for the purposes of this talk, I want to draw your attention to the number of abortions. So in the prisons, there were over 700 pregnancies that ended in that 1 year and only 11 abortions. Okay, so that's 1% of the pregnancy outcomes. That is in no way a match for or similar to the abortion ratio in the broader US, which is 18%. Now, some might say, well, maybe people got to prison further on in their pregnancies. And just very briefly, jails versus prisons, people, when they're arrested, go to jails first. Most people in jails are pre-trial and haven't been convicted of anything. And then if they are convicted of a felony level crime and have a sentence of longer than a year, then they serve that sentence usually in a state or federal prison. So you could say, well, they spent their time in jail, so they're too far along. But there were 46 miscarriages in the prisons, and miscarriages and abortions happen at the same points in pregnancy. So we should wonder, what is happening? How do we explain these data? And for me as an anthropologist, I love using this as an example of why we need qualitative research, and that the purpose of qualitative research is not to generate hypotheses for quantitative research. It is much broader than that. And in fact, in this case, the quantitative research has created all kinds of questions that only qualitative research can really answer. So if you are pregnant in custody, what is the experience like, and what does care look like? Well, this is a gross oversimplification. And of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, I myself have never been incarcerated, but I have spent time as a physician providing care in a jail. And I've worked on advocacy campaigns with previously incarcerated women who were pregnant while in prison or jail, and have been conducting research in this area for about 15 years. So this oversimplification is not based on, it's not based on my own experience, but based on a lot of evidence. And what we know is that access to prenatal care is highly variable. There are some places where people have access to a reasonable level of quality prenatal care, but in many places it's harmful or absent. A universal experience, near universal experience of pregnant individuals in custody is that it's an isolating experience. It's full of uncertainty. They don't know what's going to happen to them. They don't know when their next appointments are. They often don't know their test results. They're afraid. They don't know. They're afraid for their safety when they go to the hospital to give birth because they just don't know what's going to happen. Incarceration, by definition, limits someone's autonomy. And so what does that mean when you're a patient? What kind of autonomy do you have if you're in the setting where part of the purpose of incarceration is to revoke most of your rights? In many places, pregnant people are shackled when they're taken out of the prison or jail environment to, say, a community hospital when they're in labor or for a clinic appointment. If they give birth in custody, they don't have any say in the conditions of their birth. They're almost immediately separated from their newborns, and they don't really have much postpartum support and very limited opportunities to provide breast milk to their newborns. The shackling issue is extremely troubling, as are all of these, but it's a very visceral one. And despite all medical professional societies condemning the practice for its unsafety and its violation of basic human rights, and despite the fact that 40 states now have laws prohibiting the practice, 10 states do not have laws prohibiting it. And even when there are laws, it's not enough. It still happens even in our own state of Maryland, because the loopholes that are part of these laws get over applied. People don't know the laws. So this is all just to paint the picture that being pregnant and birthing in custody are pretty horrific experiences. And then not necessarily related to a current pregnancy, but other ways that incarcerated people's reproduction is managed. As another example is recent instances of coercive sterilization and coercive contraception in incarcerated settings. In California, a well-publicized investigation that then became an award-winning documentary, The Belly of the Beast, documented over 100 unlawful sterilizations among incarcerated people who were in the state prison system as recently as 2010. Tennessee had there was a county in Tennessee that incentivized people to have men to have free vasectomies while in jail and women to have free Nexplanon contraceptive devices in exchange for time off their jail time. That was quickly stopped as soon as the ACLU found out. And then recent allegations of unlawful gynecological or excessive gynecologic procedures for women in immigration, customs, and enforcement. And so I highlight all of these experiences of pregnancy and of coercive sterilization to frame this mass incarceration more broadly as a phenomenon that disrupts all the core tenets of reproductive justice. For those of you who are not familiar with reproductive justice, it's a framework for action and for theory and understanding that emerged from and centers the experiences of Black women and other people whose reproduction has been systematically devalued and marginalized. And there are 4 core tenets of reproductive justice that have been put forth by pioneering organizations like Sister Song. And that includes the right not to have children, right? So the right to access contraception and abortion, the right to have children and determine the conditions of your birth, the right to bodily autonomy and freedom from government interference, and the right to parent in dignity and in safe environments. And everything about incarceration disrupts these 4 core tenets. And we'll spend time focusing on that first one, the right not to have children, by the foreclosed access to abortion in custody, but it's all connected, as you'll see from some of the research findings. So a really important and fascinating legal perspective just on healthcare in general for incarcerated people is that they're the only people in our country with a constitutional right to healthcare. So let that sink in for a moment, right? We don't have healthcare guaranteed as a constitutional right, although most of us do have access to healthcare. Then you get arrested and incarcerated, you lose most of your rights, and yet you gain this right to healthcare. This comes from a 1976 Supreme Court case, Estelle versus Gamble, where the court said that the people don't have the capacity when they're incarcerated to arrange for their own medical care. They rely on the prison or jail for everything, for all their basic needs, and the facility must address them. And not to do so is cruel and unusual punishment. Now, the language in the majority opinion is that the deliberate indifference to serious medical needs of prisoners is cruel and unusual punishment. But what counts as a serious medical need? It's not up to the courts to enumerate a list of what counts. And so as a result, we don't have any mandatory healthcare standards. There's no mandatory system of oversight or accountability. So it's highly variable and discretionary what each prison or jail decides is a serious medical need and what healthcare services they want to provide, including abortion. So is abortion a serious medical need? I'm an OBGYN. Definitively, I would say yes. And I would hope that any person, but especially any healthcare provider, recognizes that it is a serious medical need. And for those prison administrators who maybe have decided it isn't a serious medical need, that it's potentially an elective procedure, we might ask, is continuing a pregnancy a serious medical need? And I would say that most prison administrators, because they are aware of the liability risks, would say yes. So before June 24th, did incarcerated people have a legal right to abortion? And the short answer is yes. The courts were clear that incarcerated people retained their constitutional right to abortion. And this was based on a number of precedents that included the Eighth Amendment, cruel and unusual punishment, and the Estelle versus Gamble mandate, and the 14th Amendment that previously provided protections for Roe. And it also was based on two other cases that affirm that prisons can only restrict someone's constitutional right if it served a penological purpose, meaning something related to punishment or to safety and security. And the courts affirmed that denying someone an abortion didn't serve any punitive, official, at least, punitive purpose. Another case also in the same year, Monmouth inmates versus Lanzaro, the judge affirmed that abortion is not an elective procedure, and therefore it counts as a serious medical need. So there were precedents all the way up to the federal district courts that affirmed they had a constitutional right to abortion. And I think the Monmouth case really taps into an important issue about what counts as elective. And I think that this came up also, this comes up not infrequently in abortion care, but it has a really, I think, unique juncture. And it came up in COVID as well. What count when hospitals were restricting and limiting the performance of elective surgeries, and where did abortion fit in with that? And so I would ask, as I did, is abortion a serious medical need? And is an abortion ever elective? And it's still common in medicine, even in my field of OBGYN, that people, and in public discourse, people think of different categories of legitimacy of abortions. There are so-called elective abortions, and then there are medically indicated abortions, like when there's preterm ruptured membranes and there's a risk of infection, or if the pregnant person has severe pulmonary hypertension and could die if they continue the pregnancy. Whereas if someone needs an abortion because they want to finish school or they can't afford another child, that those are considered elective. Those are all indicated abortions, right? They just have different indications. And I think that as a medical profession, and even the pro-choice movement, by harnessing the language of choice, has led to this fallacy that we can think of abortions as elective, and has allowed prison administrators to say, I don't have to address elective medical care. That's not a serious medical need. Now, all of this is pre-Dobbs, right? This was already happening. What was the case in terms of policies? Well, in the PIP study, we also assessed facilities' various pregnancy-related policies at baseline, and we found that not all prisons and jails allowed abortions. Some of them allowed it, but only in the first trimester. And this was true. Oh, sorry, went ahead to the next slide. So, and this was true it was discordant with state laws, right? So even, this is publicly available information, even in the state of Maryland, the Department of Correctional Services and Public Safety, the abortion policy is that it's allowed up to 14 weeks. And we're in Maryland. Abortion is legal up to viability. There's not even a number in Maryland. And in many cases, the incarcerated individual has to pay for their own abortion, right? Medicaid is suspended once you're incarcerated, so you can't even tap into Medicaid if you happen to be in a state where it's covered. In some facilities, they didn't have a written policy about abortion, and some of those cases where there was no written policy, they did allow it, and in some cases they didn't. But when there's no written policy, there's no recourse, there's no option for accountability. So you can see it was all over the map, and it was in violation of the law, right? And yet it was happening, and people reported this to our research study. We also, this table 2 there is just a little bit more on the payment. And even in a state where Medicaid would cover abortion if the person wasn't incarcerated, 3 of those prisons still required the person to pay for their own abortion. And then what about when we look at it according to and this is according to Guttmacher Institute designations of an abortion hostile state or a non-hostile state, found that even there were some facilities in hostile states that allowed abortion in the first and second trimester. So that's good. They were at least following the law. And then there were 3 facilities in non-hostile states that only allowed first trimester abortion. Again, out of step with state law. Now, even if you're at a place where the official policy says, oh yeah, you can, we allow people to access an abortion, there are a lot of barriers that are unique to this setting. Sometimes they require the incarcerated individual to figure it all out. So they might have to locate an abortion clinic, make phone calls to make an appointment or to coordinate so that the facility can make an appointment, phone calls to get funding. There's issues with scheduling the appointment to coordinate with when security staff and transport them off-site. They sometimes, and again, this has been deemed unconstitutional, but it still happens that some require court order or approval from the facility medical director. If you're required to get a court order to be transported off-site for what's called an elective procedure, well, maybe you have the savvy to contact the ACLU, but you may not. There's transport logistics to the clinic, and some facilities even require them to pay for the gas mileage for the vehicle. And then there's also their processing in the criminal legal system. They might have a court appearance that conflicts with their abortion appointment. And most people want to get out of prison or jail as soon as possible, and court appearances are hard to reschedule. So coming back to that question, did they have a legal right to abortion? Absolutely, yes, but in practice, no. We talked about how few pregnancies ended in abortion and the official and unofficial foreclosure of abortion. And I think Sheriff Joe Arpaio, retired Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Arizona, summed it up when he was sued for not allowing someone to access abortion, and the court said that he was wrong and the person was able to get their abortion. He said, you lose a lot of rights when you're in jail, whether it's trying to get an abortion or watching R-rated movies or smoking or drinking coffee. The fact that a leader who makes these decisions trivializes healthcare at the level of watching an R-rated movie shows what these people are up against. So we were really interested to understand what's happening on the ground with abortion access, and why did only 1% of these prison pregnancies end in abortion? And so we wanted to know what abortion-related decision-making and attempted access experiences were like. And we also wanted to know, maybe there are differences between prison and jail, and maybe it's different being in an abortion restrictive state versus an abortion supportive state. And so we conducted a qualitative study with semi-structured interviews at a jail and a prison, each in those 2 types of state environments. And we collected data between 2018 and 2020. The state environments of each of these 2 states, one of them, the supportive state, abortion was and is still legal up until viability. Medicaid covers abortions, not for incarcerated people, but it's there's a lot of abortion access in that state, whereas the restrictive state, which we call state R, during the course of our research passed a 6-week or cardiac activity abortion ban. And that is still in place. And you can see that abortion is relatively accessible and a little bit in the supportive state, less so in the restrictive state. And you can see a little bit more about those settings as well. So we ended up interviewing 39 pregnant people in these 2 different settings. And most of these all of the participants identified as women, so I will refer to them as women. Almost all of them had given birth to 1 child before. We were very surprised that only six of them reported a prior abortion, based on other research that suggests incarcerated, some studies suggest incarcerated people, up to 80% of them have had a prior abortion, but there could be reporting bias, or perhaps this just was a population with low abortion incidence. You can see that the median gestational age when people got arrested was 10 to 15 weeks. So still at gestational ages where certainly in the supportive state, they could have still gotten an abortion. So these were the 4 key themes that emerged in our analysis. We did have narratives of some women who were overtly prevented from having an abortion. But mostly what was more prominent was that people just assumed they didn't have a right to abortion. We also found that the bureaucracy of incarceration and court appearances and criminal processing constrained abortion access, and that the traumatic conditions of incarceration and being pregnant while in custody made people wish that they had an abortion. So in this first theme, overt obstruction, one woman described how, this is Deja. She said, they was like, we don't take people to get abortions. We don't do that anymore. And that broke my heart. The doctor was sweet as pie, but he was like, no, we don't do that. He wasn't like mean or nasty about it. He was just, I guess, confused when I asked him. So there's just this normalization, it's not exceptional. It's just, oh yeah, no, we don't provide access to rhinoplasty while you're incarcerated. Yeah, we just don't do abortions either. And then another person said, so none of the medical professionals here believe in abortion, and this was the same jail. When I brought it up, I was instantly shot down. Why would you want to abort your baby? Children are blessings. You shouldn't get an abortion. They wouldn't even discuss it with me, telling me all the different ways that I was wrong and I shouldn't get an abortion. And so not only were they judged and stigmatized for their choices, this also meant that they didn't receive any information, any accurate information about their options for their pregnancy. They just were, it was not even on the table. And so it's not surprising that incarcerated people would internalize the sense that they just don't have a right to abortion. The assumption was cultivated by 2 primary means. First, they assumed that they didn't have any rights in the first place. And again, because no healthcare staff mentioned abortion, said, well, they assumed like, well, I guess if I could have had it, the doctor in the jail would have brought it up. So they just assumed it wasn't an option. And as this woman in State R's prison, she was talking about her experience in the jail she had been in before she got to that prison. She said, even if I did want an abortion, I don't think I would have gotten the chance to get one just for the fact I was incarcerated. And basically you have no rights when you're sitting in county jail. Another person in the jail in State S said, we're not looked at as people, we're looked at as inmates, so all of our decisions are taken from us, even with our pregnancies. And then someone in prison in State S said, from my understanding, and she was saying this in sort of a passive way, I was told that if you wanted an abortion when you're here at DOC, you can't because you were the state's property. This woman felt like she was the state's property and therefore as a non-human, she had no rights. Now, there were also things about the bureaucracy of being in prison, the way the healthcare system is set up and functions or doesn't function, and also court appearances I mentioned, that interfered with people's abilities to access healthcare, pregnancy-related healthcare, even just knowing that they're pregnant, getting a pregnancy test, or transitions from jail to prison. There's delays in seeing a medical provider, one woman in the jail in State S said, they told me that even if they were to put it in, if the doctors put in started to make the arrangements for an outside abortion, that it's going to be a month before I can see an OBGYN who would actually make the appointment for the abortion, and that I wouldn't be able to get, wouldn't be able to get an abortion anyway in a timely manner. So the delays in seeing a healthcare provider in jail or prison also play a role, even though there are mechanisms in place for time-sensitive care. Another woman in State R's jail said, I think I just gave up trying after so much time had passed. She had asked multiple times about getting an abortion and it didn't happen. No one got back to her. So I thought that maybe this pregnancy might be my punishment. I accepted it. The pregnancy was she perceived it as part of her sentence, as part of her punishment. And another woman in State S, she had been, her pregnancy diagnosis was delayed despite her repeated requests for a pregnancy test. And she was 22 weeks when she found out she was pregnant, which in this state, actually in the state that she was in, was actually technically still legal, but it was beyond her own personal limit as well. And so she felt like she was coerced into having this baby. I was made to have this baby because of all of these delays. Now, we encountered many participants who said, that they hadn't considered abortion for this pregnancy when they found out. Most of the pregnancies were unplanned, but most people told the story how when they found out, they had a lot of feelings, but ultimately they became, excited or they were looking forward to this pregnancy, except for people who found out that they were pregnant while they were in custody. And then once they became incarcerated, their feelings changed, because of the utter bereftness of being pregnant, being incarcerated while pregnant, and the trauma of being so isolated, of the conditions that they're subjected to. One woman in State R's prison said, "I would have had an abortion because I'd rather just not put this baby through all of this." So their desires for an abortion, their changed desires for abortions, often came from a place of care and love, as well as from their own suffering, and wanting to avoid the suffering of a baby that they might have to give birth to. Another woman also in State R's prison said, "I remember thinking to myself, this would all be so much easier being in prison. It would be easier if I just aborted," almost regretting, not because of the child, but it's just an emotional toll going through being incarcerated. And then another woman in State S talked about how stressful it was being here, and you worry about how your fetus, actually I always use the word baby, but it makes you resent being pregnant. "I don't necessarily want the baby now. Before I did, I just don't want to be in here pregnant." Then you don't know what they're going to do with your baby after you have it. Are they going to let you hold your baby? How heartbreaking is that? So she was denied an abortion. This is a woman who actually had tried to get an abortion. Then she's not even sure if they're going to let you hold your baby. So in summary, being incarcerated shapes people, in summary from the study, being incarcerated shapes people's abilities to access abortion. And it didn't really matter, not that we did a statistical comparison, but the themes were the same, whether it was the restrictive state or the supportive state. People's abilities to assess whether abortion is even an option for them entirely depends on the institutional culture of the prison or jail. And their thoughts and feelings about their pregnancies changed as a result of being incarcerated. People received systematic misinformation about whether abortion was an option for them. Their rights were violated. And this, again, was before Roe was overturned, when abortion was still legal in all states. And there was pervasive, maybe not pervasive, but the fact that it was at one jail, pervasive among several physicians, anti-abortion sentiment, and that's allowed for that to impact people's clinical care is troubling, as well as the internalized sense that they had no rights. And so then people are coerced to give birth with variable access to prenatal care and not knowing if they're even going to be able to hold their baby. So incarcerated pregnant people, they were already living in a post-Roe reality. So what now for them? If it was already really horrible for them to be able to access abortion, is much going to change for them? We don't know, but I feel confident that things will change, and not for the better. So since the latest map from the Guttmacher Institute shows that 12 states have banned abortion or severely restricted in most cases, and a few others are very restrictive. If you think about it, even when there is this, at least in theory, a legal right to abortion if you were incarcerated, now if you're in one of these states that bans abortion, you can't get one because you cannot travel to another state, right? You're confined. You don't have the freedom. And although it's expensive and a lot to arrange, it's not even on the table for you to try to go to New Mexico if you're in Texas, or North Carolina if you're in Georgia. So their options for abortion are severely foreclosed. And as we're already starting to see in community hospital settings in restrictive states, there's a lot of confusion among providers as to what to do in obstetrical emergencies like miscarriage or pre-viable ruptured when the water breaks before the fetus is viable, or even ectopic pregnancies. And women patients are being turned away from emergency departments for other life-saving medical care until they're at death's door. So that's going to impact incarcerated people as well, incarcerated pregnant people, but likely in very unique ways that are structured by the particularities of carceral healthcare and the fact that they have limited options and no say in the healthcare they can access. So it's gonna impact their abilities or the care that they receive if they experience miscarriages or ectopics or other obstetrical complications. You know, the prison or jail transports people off-site, they should, to community emergency departments when there's an emergency. But if that community hospital refuses to treat that person, then they get sent back to the prison or jail, and they are ill-equipped to deal with obstetrical emergencies, and they don't want to. They don't want to. And it is, I hypothesize, is a perfect storm for exacerbated moral distress, right? And fear of liability as well. And this is going to impact their ability to provide subsequent and quality, not that it necessarily was always quality pregnancy care, but this is, I think, just a setup for worsening care in this situation, in this setting. Also, access to contraception. I've already anecdotally heard of one jail in Missouri that stopped providing emergency contraception, falsely equating it with abortion. We also, I suspect, may see an increased number in pregnant individuals in custody, in part because we anticipate in restrictive states that there will be more pregnant people in general because people aren't going to be able to access abortion. Also, we may see more increased criminalization of pregnant individuals, especially those who might try to self-manage abortions, although so far patients themselves are not being prosecuted. And these are, you know, with increased volume of pregnant patients, these are facilities that are already ill-equipped to take care of pregnant individuals, and it's already a traumatizing place. Another thing to consider for this environment is the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which was passed in 2002 and has certain provisions related to reproductive health care that prisons and jails have to provide timely access to emergency contraception. And so if a facility decides they're not going to provide it, if the state misinterprets EC as an abortion pill, they won't provide access to it. And if someone is raped when they're in custody and becomes pregnant as a result of that, if they are in one of the 14 states that has no exception for rape or incest, then they are going to have to carry that pregnancy that was conceived in state violence. That is just horrific. And so incarcerated pregnant people get punished through pregnancy. And this intersects and violates all 4 core tenets of reproductive justice. They're denied the right not to have children. They're denied the right to determine the conditions of their births. They're denied the right to have safe and supported pregnancies. And they're denied the right to parent their children. And this can happen all in one pregnancy. So they were already living in a post-Roe reality where abortion access was not protected. And Deja, whom I mentioned at the beginning, and some of her quotes were also in the results that I presented, her abortion denial in 2018 was illegal. But because prisons and jails are out of view of public and legal scrutiny, they can institute their own, sometimes unconstitutional healthcare policies, like not permitting abortion. So for women like Deja and others who are now incarcerated where abortion is banned, their forced pregnancies become part of their state-sanctioned punishment. And the state's claim to their reproductive bodies becomes extreme in this setting where carceral control, these logics of punishment and control, they definitionally revoke bodily autonomy. So then they're conscripted into gestating these pregnancies in the harsh conditions of incarceration. If they give birth, they might be shackled when they give birth, and they're likely going to be separated soon after, making someone like Deja wonder, are they even going to let me hold my baby? This reality is going to be replicated and expanded now that the previous constitutional protections that were at least in theory in place for incarcerated pregnant people, they're now gone. So the state is precluding incarcerated people from having abortions, from having safe pregnancies and parenting their children. And this nexus of criminalization, reproductive governance, it shows up in its most extreme form in institutions of incarceration, but this is what's happening all across the country, especially in restrictive states, because what happens out of sight of public scrutiny, this is the punitive sentiment of, surrounding pregnancy, the reality that we are living in the United States, where pregnancy can be experienced as punishment. So thank you very much. I want to thank especially my research team, especially Camille Kramer, my amazing research program manager, the study sites, our funder, and the participants who shared their experiences with us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, a couple of microphones.
And there's one in the chat as well.
Great.
Yeah, we have one question online from Len. And it says, thank you for this terrific presentation. Could you address what clinicians working in carceral settings can do to expand access to pregnancy care, including abortion, and what are their obligations to do so?
Great question. In terms of their legal obligations, that's still in restrictive states, not entirely clear because there are some exceptions that where, and Len, perhaps you may know this more than I do, but exceptions where perhaps Estelle may trump what the Dobbs decision says. But in abortion supportive states, this is a call to action. We need prisons and jails and abortion in states where abortion is still legal. They need to get up to speed and get their policies to be legal. And we need accountability organizations. The ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project is one of them, but they're quite busy with just case-to-case litigation. But we need some broader accountability and standardization. Organizations like the American College of OBGYNs, as well as the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare, they have published recommended standards for what should happen, and ensuring access to abortion is one of those. So it's very clear clinically. So we need a system to ensure that clinical standards are being met in states where abortion is still legal. How do we do that? We need a complete overhaul of carceral healthcare, right? We need something where they actually are accountable. One strategy, and Len is well aware of this, we've worked on this together with Brendan Saloner, who's also faculty here, is for one, eliminating the Medicaid exclusion policy, or the so-called inmate exclusion policy of Medicaid that would then allow facilities to bill Medicaid for healthcare. This would then bring some form, not a perfect form, but some form of accountability, because they would have to meet Medicaid standards or services in order to get reimbursed. But it's unconscionable to me that carceral facilities can get away with not providing standard of care. So we need a broader system that ensures that, so that facilities in abortion supportive states follow the law of their state. In terms of what can be done in abortion restrictive states, there may be some avenues where they could, some facilities will transport people out of state for healthcare that their state can't provide, like certain cancer treatments. Certainly, I know that that's not uncommon for the federal prison system, and so that transport mechanism potentially could be encouraged. But for providers on the ground, they need to recognize their professional obligations, right? And what their profession for OBGYNs, our main professional society, ACOG, is very clear on this. And so, whether that's, tying it to their recertification, I don't know, but we need a multi-pronged strategy, but structurally as well, to have an oversight of the carceral healthcare system.
Thanks, Carolyn, for fabulous and heartbreaking talk. I actually have two questions. I don't know if I have time for two. The first has to do with sort of how is it that all these people are pregnant in prison? I mean, I had this conversation with you a little bit offline, but they can come in pregnant, or they can become pregnant through conjugal visits, or they can be raped. And you alluded to rape at the end. I didn't know whether you were talking about rape that occurred on the outside, that through which they came in pregnant. But do they have any
Yeah, good question. And I will say in our study, we did try to, in the PIP study, we tried to assess if anyone became pregnant while still in custody. And there were, I think, 4 cases of pregnancies that were diagnosed like a month after someone had been there. And in 3 of the cases, it was, or when they had been there for longer than a month. In 3 of the cases, it was just, oh, we didn't do a pregnancy test until the next month of reporting for the study. And then in 1 case, it was someone who had a furlough for work release into the community. There may be underreporting. No one, we explicitly asked about pregnancies conceived as a result of rape, and there were none. In terms of recourse, in theory, PREA is, you know, this system of accountability, and PREA compliance is a big thing in the prison world. Are they compliant? Probably not consistently, but PREA is a very big federal legislation that applies to all all carceral facilities. So in theory there is, but in terms, as I highlight, in terms of being able to access abortion, that's not at all guaranteed. It says you need to provide access to all pregnancy options in accordance with state law.
So my other question is, so it took my breath away, actually, when you said that the language of pro-choice is actually contributing to the idea that abortion is elective and no ease.
I'm so glad you asked, because this is just another reason why the framework of reproductive justice is so valuable. And this was, you know, one of the many critiques that upon which reproductive justice was based, that the reproductive rights movement that was, you know, led primarily by white middle-class women, completely ignored the broader social and structural context and the centuries of white supremacy and oppression that foreclosed other parts of abortion and just saw abortion and contraception as that was it, right? But no, it's, yes, we need access to abortion and contraception, but we also need the material resources and a society that will safely support us having the children that we want to raise. And so thinking of it as in a justice framework rather than a choice, because everyone's ability to make choices is differential and is determined by their position in society, is determined by the material resources they have to freely make choices. And so people on the who are marginalized by systems of oppression, for them, they don't have equal access to make free choices. And so talking about abortion as a choice, it's like missing the big picture. And so then, you know, when you think about it that way, it makes total sense why we should look to incarcerated people and what's happening there with their pregnancies to tell us more broadly about what's happening in our society. And I think the pro-choice movement, by focusing on choice, exactly, and it allows and still allows prison administrators to say, oh, it's a choice. It's elective. That's not a serious medical need.
Sorry, you mentioned sort of standardizing and improving on data systems and reporting and that sort of thing. I noticed, maybe I got this wrong, but it seemed like Oregon was one of the states that was sort of the most competitive, but at the same time, one of the states that did report on pregnancy incarcerated. So,
yes. So for the study, it was just me for a while, and I just didn't have the capacity to recruit all 50 states. So I had a sampling strategy of starting with the states that had more than 2,000 females in their prison system and then snowball sampling from there. I actually did ask Oregon to participate, even though they have a smaller female population, but they declined participation in the study, as did New York and California. And
do you have a sense of what's going on there?
yeah, well, I can tell you exactly why they declined to participate in the study. New York State said, we don't have anybody who could, who could track the data and report it for your study, which to me says it's not a priority, right? This is it, like, yes, it was a research study, but this is just QI data, right? Quality, like you should know what's happening in terms of the healthcare indices at your facility. And then California said they had a penal code, they did have a penal code that precluded research with prisoners. It was then lifted in, I think, 2017, but we had already started doing the study. But they interpreted this, even though we collected de-identified administrative aggregate data, they still interpreted it as as that. I thought you were going to say Oregon does not have an anti-shackling law, which is surprising. Oregon does not have an anti-shackling law. Their prison does have a policy of not restraining, but yeah.
Maybe we have.
Yeah, there's one more question online. Really quickly, thinking about these self-lease, if the appropriate language around abortion is either induced or spontaneous, removing terms like elective or necessary. Are you aware of these language changes being systematically implemented in medical school, residency, fellowship, or other training settings?
Great question. I can tell you that in my subspecialty in OBGYN complex family planning, most of us have definitely moved to talking about induced and spontaneous abortion, and that is the terminology we prefer. So thank you, because I didn't follow up to Gail's question with what else. So that's the what else, induced abortions instead of elective abortions. And I mean, here at Johns Hopkins, we teach our medical students the language. We talk about it on their rotation. We don't use the language of elective. Same with our residents and our fellows, but that's just a small group of us within a much broader field of OBGYN, and it's going to have to happen over time. The way that language changes do. But thank you to that person for bringing up that language of induced versus spontaneous.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Sufrin.
Thank you.